His story is one of the most remarkable of any world leader. Few in history have endured oppression with such little rancor, or overcome the oppressor with such little bloodshed.
The prehistory and history of South Africa span nearly the entire known existence of human beings and their ancestors, some 3 million years or more, and include the wandering of small bands of hominins through the savanna, the inception of herding and farming as ways of life, and the construction of large urban centers. Through this diversity of human experience, several trends can be identified: technological and economic change, shifting systems of belief, and, in the earlier phases of humanity, the interplay between physical evolution and learned behavior, or culture. Over much of this time frame, South Africa's past is also that of a far wider area, and only in the last few centuries has this southernmost country of Africa had a history of its own. This article focuses on the country of South Africa. For information about the country in its region, the earliest creatures that can be identified as ancestors of modern humans are classified as Australopithecines, literally, southern apes. The first specimen of these hominins to be found, in 1924, was the skull of a child from a quarry site at Tong in what is now the Northwest Province. Subsequently, more Australopithecine fossils were discovered in limestone caves farther northeast at Sterkfontein, Swartkrans, and Kromdijk, collectively designated a World Heritage Site in 1999, where they had originally been deposited by predators and scavengers. South Africa's prehistory has been divided into a series of phases based on broad patterns of technology. The primary distinction is between a reliance on chipped and flaked stone implements, the Stone Age, and the ability to work iron, the Iron Age. Spanning a large proportion of human history, the Stone Age in southern Africa is further divided into the Early Stone Age, or Paleolithic period, about 2,500,000–150,000 years ago, the Middle Stone Age, or Mesolithic period, about 150,000–30,000 years ago, and the Late Stone Age, or Neolithic period, about 30,000–2,000 years ago. The simple stone tools found with Australopithecine fossil bones fall into the earliest part of the Early Stone Age. Most early Stone Age sites in South Africa can probably be connected with the hominine species known as Homo erectus. Simply modified stones, hand axes, scraping tools, and other bifacial artifacts had a wide variety of purposes, including butchering animal carcasses, scraping hides, and digging for plant foods. Most South African archaeological sites from this period are the remains of open camps, often by the sides of rivers and lakes, although some are rock shelters, such as Montague Cave in the Cape region. Change occurred slowly in the early Stone Age. For more than 1 million years and over a wide geographic area, only slight differences existed in the forms of stone tools. The slow alterations in hominins' physical appearance that took place over the same time period, however, have allowed physical anthropologists to recognize new species in the genus Homo. An archaic form of H. sapiens appeared about 500,000 years ago. Important specimens belonging to this physical type have been found at Hopefield in Western Cape Province and at the Cave of Hearths in Mpumalanga Province. The long episode of cultural and physical evolution gave way to a period of more rapid change about 200,000 years ago. Hand axes and large bifacial stone tools were replaced by stone flakes and blades that were fashioned into scrapers, spear points, and parts for hafted, composite implements. This technological stage, now known as the Middle Stone Age, is represented by numerous sites in South Africa. Open camps and rock overhangs were used for shelter. Day-to-day debris has survived to provide some evidence of early ways of life, although plant foods have rarely been preserved. Middle Stone Age bands hunted medium-sized and large prey, including antelope and zebra, although they tended to avoid the largest and most dangerous animals, such as the elephant and the rhinoceros. They also ate seabirds and marine mammals that could be found along the shore, and sometimes collected tortoises and ostrich eggs in large quantities. The rich archaeological deposits of Classes River mouth on the Cape Coast west of Port Elizabeth have preserved the first known instance of shellfish being used as a food source. Classes River mouth has also provided important evidence for the emergence of anatomically modern humans. Some of the human skeletons from the lower levels of this site, possibly 115,000 years old, are decidedly modern in form. Fossils of comparable age have been excavated at Border Cave, in the mountainous region between KwaZulu-Natal Province and Eswatini. Basic toolmaking techniques began to undergo additional change about 40,000 years ago. Small finely worked stone implements known as microliths became more common, while the heavier scrapers and points of the Middle Stone Age appeared less frequently. Archaeologists refer to this technological stage as the Late Stone Age. The numerous collections of stone tools from South African archaeological sites show a great degree of variation through time and across the subcontinent. The remains of plant foods have been well preserved at such sites as Melkhoutboom Cave, De Hongen, and Diepkloof in the Cape region. Animals were trapped and hunted with spears and arrows on which were mounted well-crafted stone blades. Bands moved with the seasons as they followed games into higher lands in the spring and early summer months, when plant foods could also be found. When available, rock overhangs became shelters, otherwise, windbreaks were built. Shellfish, crayfish, seals, and seabirds were also important sources of food, as were fish caught on lines, with spears, in traps, and possibly with nets. Dating from this period are numerous engravings on rock surfaces, mostly on the interior plateau, and paintings on the walls of rock shelters in the mountainous regions, such as the Drakensberg and Cedarburg ranges. The images were made over a period of at least 25,000 years. Although scholars originally saw the South African rock art as the work of exotic foreigners such as Minoans or Phoenicians or as the product of primitive minds, they now believe that the paintings were closely associated with the work of medicine men, shamans who were involved in the well-being of the band and often worked in a state of trance. Specific representations include depictions of trance dances, metaphors for trance such as death and flight, rainmaking, and control of the movement of antelope herds. New ways of living came to South Africa about 2,000 years ago. Until that time, human communities had survived by gathering plant foods and by hunting, trapping, and scavenging for meat, but with the introduction of agriculture, arguably the single most important event in world history, people began to make use of domesticated animals and plants. This in turn led to a slow but steady rise in population and to more complex political and religious organizations, among other things. Crops could be grown and cattle, sheep, and goats herded near permanent villages and towns in the east, where rainfall was adequate. In the more arid west, domestic livestock were kept by nomadic pastoralists, who moved over wide territories with their flocks and herds. Although the origin of nomadic pastoralism in South Africa is still obscure, linguistic evidence points to northern Botswana as a probable source. The linguistic evidence is supported by finds of sheep bones and pottery from Bambata Cave in southwestern Zimbabwe that have been dated to about 150 BCE. Whether new communities moved into South Africa with their flocks and herds or whether established hunter-gatherer bands took up completely new ways of living remains unclear. In any case, the results of archaeological excavations have shown that sheep were being herded fairly extensively by the first few centuries in eastern and western parts of the Cape and probably in the Northern Cape as well. While traces of ancient herding camps tend to be extremely rare, one of the best preserved finds is at Casteelberg, on the southwest coast near St. Helena Bay. Pastoralists there kept sheep, hunted seals and other wild animals, and gathered shellfish, repeatedly returning to the same site for some 1,500 years. Such communities were directly ancestral to the Khokho, also spelled Khoikhoi, herders who encountered European settlers at the Cape of Good Hope in the mid-17th century. The archaeological traces of farmers in the eastern regions of South Africa are more substantial. The earliest sites date to the 3rd century, although farming was probably already well established by this time. Scatters of potsherds with distinctive incised decoration mark early village locations in Mpumalanga and parts of KwaZulu-Natal. Because the first farmers had knowledge of ironworking, their archaeological sites are characterized as Iron Age 200 CE. New groups of people arriving in South Africa at that time had strong connections to East Africa. They were directly ancestral to the Bantu-speaking peoples who form the majority of South Africa's population today. Early Iron Age farmers grew crops, cutting back the vegetation with iron hoes and axes, and herded cattle and sheep. They heavily supplemented farming by gathering wild plant foods, engaging in some hunting, and collecting shellfish if they lived near enough to the coast. Where conditions for agriculture were favorable, such as in the Tugela River Valley in the east, villages grew to house several hundred people. Some trade existed between groups of farmers. Evidence for specialization in salt-making has been found in the northeast, and with the hunter-gatherer bands that continued to occupy most parts of South Africa. Finely made life-size ceramic heads found near the city of Lydenburg, now Mashishing, in eastern South Africa and dated to the 7th century are all that remains of the people who once inhabited this region. Early Iron Age villages were built in low-lying areas, such as river valleys and the coastal plain, where forests and savannas facilitated shifting, slash-and-burn agriculture. From the 11th century, however, in the period conventionally known as the Late Iron Age, farming communities began to settle the higher-lying grasslands. It has not been established whether these new communities were inhabited by invaders or reflected the diffusion of new knowledge to existing populations. In many areas the new communities started making different forms of pottery and built villages out of stone. Most probably these and other changes in patterns of behavior reflect the increasing importance of cattle in economic life. Other changes came in the north. Arab traders established small settlements on the Tanzanian and Mozambican coasts in their search for ivory, animal skins, and other exotica. The trade beads they offered in return began to reach villages in the interior, the first indications that the more complex economic and social structures associated with long-distance trade were developing. The arid Limpopo River Valley, avoided by the earliest farmers, developed as a trade route. Sites such as Pontdrift, circa 800, 1100, and Schroeder, dated to the 9th century, show that their occupants were wealthy in both livestock and trade beads. The Limpopo River Valley was also the setting in which Bambandianalo and Mapungubwe developed as South Africa's first urban centers during the 11th century. Starting as a large village like Schroeder and Pontdrift, Mapungubwe rapidly developed into a town of approximately 10,000 people. Differences in status were clearly demarcated. The elite lived and were buried at the top of the stark sandstone hill at the town's center, while the rest of the population lived in the valley below. Hilltop graves contained lavish burial goods, including a carefully crafted gold rhinoceros and evidence of specialized crafts such as bone and ivory working. Bambandianalo and Mapungubwe were abandoned after the 13th century after having been occupied for several hundred years. The trade connections that the Limpopo Valley offered were taken over by Great Zimbabwe, farther to the north. From 1770 to 1870 the region became more fully integrated into the world capitalist economy. Trekboers, who were weakly controlled by the Dutch East India Company, advanced across the semi-desert Karoo of the Central Cape and collided with African agricultural peoples along a line running from the lower Vaal and middle Orange River valleys to the sea around the Gamtoos River west of modern Port Elizabeth. These agriculture-based African societies proved resilient but, even at their height in the 1860s, were unable to unite completely enough to expel the Europeans. The decisive moment for the colony occurred in 1806 when Britain seized Cape Colony during the Napoleonic Wars. Initially the colony's importance was related to its function as a strategic base to protect Britain's developing empire in India. In the next few years, however, it also served as a market, a source of raw materials, and an outlet for emigration from Britain. African societies after the 1760s were increasingly affected by ivory and slave traders operating from Delagoa Bay, Inhambane, and the lower Zambezi River in the northeast as well as by traders and raiders based in the Cape to the south. In response to these invasions, the farming communities created a number of sister states different in structure, scale, and military capacity from anything that had existed before. The Pedi and Swazi in the eastern Highveld, the Zulu south of the Pongola River, the Sotho to the east of the Caledon River Valley, the Gaza along the lower Limpopo, and the Ndebele in present-day southwestern Zimbabwe proved to be the most successful. The areas of the Western Cape with the longest history of settlement by Europeans had evolved an agricultural economy based on wheat farming and viticulture, worked by imported slave labor. Slaves were treated harshly, and punishments for slaves who assaulted Europeans were brutal, one of the most heinous beings death by impalement. Escaped slaves formed groups called Maroons, small self-sufficient communities, or fled into the interior. Because slave birth rates were low and settler numbers were increasing, in the 1780s the Dutch stepped up the enserfment of surviving Khoi, also spelled Khoi, pejoratively called Hottentots, to help run their farms. The Khoi who could escape Dutch subjugation joined Xhosa groups in a major counter-offensive against colonialism in 1799–1801, and there were slave rebellions in the outskirts of Cape Town in 1808 and 1825. The Dutch refusal to grant citizenship and land rights to the colored offspring of unions between Europeans and Khoi or slaves produced an aggrieved class of people, known as basters or bastards, who were Christian, spoke Dutch, and had an excellent knowledge of horses and firearms. Many fled north toward and over the Orange River in search of land and trading opportunities. After merging with independent Khoi groups, such as the Kora, they formed commando states under warlords, three of the more successful being the Bloem, Coke, and Barons families, who were persuaded by missionaries in the early 19th century to change their name to Griqua. By the 1790s they were trading with and raiding local African communities such as the Rolong, Tulhaping, Huruch, and Ngwakats. For self-defense some of these African communities formed larger groupings who competed against each other in their quest to control trade routes going south to the Cape and east to present-day Mozambique. The Portuguese and also some British, French, Americans, and Arabs traded beads, brass, cloth, alcohol, and firearms along the southeast coast in return for ivory, slaves, cattle, gold, wax, and skins. During the late 18th century, large volumes of ivory were exported annually from Delagoa Bay, and slaves were taken from the Kamati and Usutu, a major tributary of the Maputo River regions, and sent to the Mascarene Islands in the Indian Ocean and to Brazil to work on sugarcane and coffee plantations. By 1800 trade routes linked Delagoa Bay and coastal trade routes with the central interior. European trade precipitated structural transformation within societies inland of Delagoa Bay. Warlords reorganized military institutions to hunt elephants and slaves. Profits from this trade enhanced the warlords' ability to disperse patronage, attract followers, and raise military potential and, in turn, their capacity to dominate land, people, and cattle. Near the bay, Tembe and Maputo were already powerful states by the 1790s. To the west of the coastal lowlands emerged the Marotang of Thalaire, the Dlamini of Ndvanganye, and the Halubi of Bungan. Between the Pongola and Tugela rivers evolved the Mthethwa of Dingiswayo south of Lake Street. Lucia, the Ndwandwa of Zwide, the Kwabe of Fakatwayo, the Chanu of Masingwane, and, south of the Tugela, the Sele and Thuli. Several groups, for example, the Mthethwa, Ndwandwa, and Kwabe, later merged with the Zulu. These groups competed to dominate trade and became more militarized the closer they were to the Portuguese base. The Cape Colony had spawned the sub-colonies of Natal, the Orange Free State, and the Transvaal by the 1860s. European settlement advanced to the edges of the Kalahari region in the west, the Drakensberg and Natal coast in the east, and the tsetse fly and mosquito-ridden Lowveld along the Limpopo River Valley in the northeast. Armed clashes erupted over land and cattle, such as those between the Boers and various Xhosa groups in the southeast beginning in the 1780s, and Africans lost most of their land and were henceforth forced to work for the settlers. The population of European settlers increased from some 20,000 in the 1780s to about 300,000 in the late 1860s. Although it is difficult to accurately estimate the African population, it probably numbered somewhere between 2 and 4 million. The first Portuguese ships rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, their occupants intent on gaining a share of the lucrative Arab trade with the East. Over the following century, numerous vessels made their way around the South African coast, but the only direct African contacts came with the bands of shipwreck survivors who either set up camp in the hope of rescue or tried to make their way northward to Portuguese settlements in present-day Mozambique. Both the British and the Dutch challenged the Portuguese control of the Cape Sea route from the early 17th century. The British founded a short-lived settlement at Table Bay in 1620, and in 1652 the Dutch East India Company set up a small garrison under the slopes of Table Mountain for provisioning their fleets. The Dutch East India Company, always mindful of unnecessary expense, did not intend to establish more than a minimal presence at the southernmost part of Africa. Because farming beyond the shores of Table Bay proved necessary, however, 9 men were released from their contracts with the company and granted land along the Liesbeek River in 1657. The company made it clear that the cocoa were not to be enslaved, so, beginning in that same year, slaves arrived in the Cape from West and East Africa, India, and the Malay Peninsula. By the end of the century, the imprint of Dutch colonialism in South Africa was clear, with settlers, aided by increasing numbers of slaves, growing wheat, tending vineyards, and grazing their sheep and cattle from the Cape Peninsula to the Hottentots Holland Mountains some 30 miles 50 kilometers away. A 1707 census of the Dutch at the Cape listed 1,779 settlers owning 1,107 slaves. In the initial years of Dutch settlement at the Cape, pastoralists had readily traded with the Dutch. However, as the garrison's demand for cattle and sheep continued to increase, the cocoa became more wary. The Dutch offered tobacco, alcohol, and trinkets for livestock. Numerous conflicts followed, and, beginning in 1713, many cocoa communities were ravaged by smallpox. At the same time, colonial pastoralists, the Boers, also called Trekboers, began to move inland beyond the Hottentots Holland Mountains with their own herds. The cocoa chiefdoms were largely decimated by the end of the 18th century, their people either dead or reduced to conditions close to serfdom on colonial farms. The San, small bands of hunter-gatherers, fared no better. Pushed back into marginal areas, they were forced to live by cattle raiding, justifying in colonial eyes their systematic eradication. The men were slaughtered, and the women and children were taken into servitude. The Trekboers constantly sought new land, and they and their families spread northeast as well as north, into the grasslands that long had been occupied by African farmers. For many generations these farmers had lived in settlements concentrated along the low ridges that break the monotony of the interior plateau. While it is difficult to make population estimates, it is thought that some of the larger villages could have housed several hundred people. Cattle were held in elaborately built stone enclosures, the ruins of which survive today across a large part of Free State Province and in the higher areas north of the Vaal River. Extensive exchange networks brought iron for hoes and spears from specialized manufacturing centers in the Mpumalanga Lowveld and the deep river gorges of KwaZulu-Natal. Thus, by the closing decades of the 18th century, South Africa had fallen into 2 broad regions, West and East. Colonial settlement dominated the West, including the winter rainfall region around the Cape of Good Hope, the coastal hinterland northward toward the present-day border with Namibia, and the dry lands of the interior. Trekboers took increasingly more land from the cocoa and from remnant hunter-gatherer communities, who were killed, were forced into marginal areas, or became laborers tied to the farms of their new overlords. Indigenous farmers controlled both the coastal and valley lowlands and the highveld of the interior in the east, where summer rainfall and good grazing made mixed farming economies possible. Cape Town was developing into South Africa's major urban center, although it took many years for it to equal the size that Mapungubwe had attained some 5 centuries earlier. The initial grid of streets had been expanded and linked the company's garden to the new fortress that overlooked Table Bay. Houses featuring flat roofs, ornate pediments, and symmetrical facades sheltered officials, merchants, and visitors en route between Europe and the East. A governor and council administered the town and colony. While the economy was in principle directed by the interests of the Dutch East India Company, in practice corruption and illegal trading were dominant forces. Both the town and the colony existed in large part because of slaves, who by now outnumbered their owners.